Rationally, we know, and there have been studies, that nuclear energy is one of the safest forms of power generation. And yet, most people are more afraid of nuclear than they are of other sources that they're more familiar with.
Chernobyl.
The Chernobyl accident.
Chernobyl. The Chernobyl accident.
World's worst nuclear accident.
Serious core melt.
A damaged reactor.
Fire has destroyed most of the reactor's core.
World's worst nuclear disaster.
I don't think they know how serious it is.
Casualty rates are higher than those that have been announced by the Soviet Union so far.
We know next to nothing.
And I don't think that they're going to accept international aid.
We don't know exactly what's happened yet.
The situation is under control.
Chernobyl, one of the most horrific power plant explosions in history. The meltdown contaminated over half of Europe with radioactive fallout. Workers scrambled to assess the situation, but the damage had already been done, and thousands of local residents were forced to face the consequences. This disaster emitted over 400 times more radiation than at the bombing of Hiroshima and signaled the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet Union, the question of acquiring nuclear technology was a matter of a major national pride.
After World War II, the Soviet Union experienced a long period of political tensions with the US.
The Soviet Union was a huge country that inherited the territory from the Russian Empire. There was belief that the Soviet technology, in particular nuclear technology, or anything dealing, for example, with space, was superior to American.
The first Sputnik. It proved a point of tremendous importance. The Sputniks were followed by space rockets.
The Soviets were the first to put man into the orbit. There was a belief that in some areas, in particular areas dealing with nuclear and space, they were ahead of the US.
This accident at 3 Mile Island brought home the need to assure that nuclear power is as safe as possible.
Reactors don't explode, they don't go into meltdown in the Soviet Union. That's something that can happen only in the capitalist world.
Nuclear power appeared from military applications. United States developed nuclear bomb, Soviet Union developed nuclear bomb. We need nuclear reactors for military applications, and we started with small ones in 1954. They built a small plant for basically propaganda reasons, saying, okay, we are not like the United States. We are trying to use the power of nuclear for peaceful purposes, but really didn't put any thought into that in terms of the economic development. Ukraine traditionally had a quite significant industrial capability. Coal that they were getting at that time became more and more difficult to extract, so they were looking for other sources of energy. They will lobby in Moscow for 3 nuclear power plants. Moscow found money to build just 1. They found a location where land was not very productive. It's close to border with Belarus, it's forest, there is Pripyat river there.
And that's where they built the nuclear power plant.
The Chernobyl power complex lies about 75 miles north of Kiev, Ukraine, and consists of 4 nuclear reactors.
Construction of the power plant itself and the nearby town of Pripyat, which was to house the workers, started in 1970. And the first reactor was commissioned in 1977, the second one in 1978, a third one in 1981, and a fourth one in 1983.
The city of Pripyat was one of the youngest cities in Ukraine and in the Soviet Union. Mostly it was young workforce and young engineers that came to work in this new and exciting industry. If you like fishing, if you like hunting, all of that was just a few hundred meters away from you. And at the same time, there was this new industry which was considered to be extremely clean.
In 1979, when I graduated from the institute, we had technical tour to one of the Chernobyl reactors. And I was absolutely astonished to see such a 21st century plant.
And it was really amazing.
The country got a new, very dynamic leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was looking for the ways to improve economy. The hopes were really very high that nuclear would help to lift the Soviet economy out of that abyss that it was heading.
Some of the Soviet Union's top minds developed innovative new technologies that they hoped would put them at the forefront of scientific exploration.
The Soviet Union was responsible for the design of the RBMK reactor, a graphite-moderated water-cooled reactor.
The RBMK design was unlike any other power reactor in the world. Though it was one of a kind, it had its shortcomings. Nuclear reactors rely on fission to create heat, which generates steam that spins a turbine, creating electricity.
A large atom of a fissile material, in most cases uranium-235, is hit by a neutron. It releases energy in the form of heat, and it also releases, on average, 2 to 3 neutrons.
For every fast neutron that you're generating, they're not encountering other uranium-235 atoms in order to cause another fission. You want a chain reaction.
To increase the changes of fission, the RBMK reactor uses a moderator to convert a fast neutron into a slow neutron.
And they found that certain materials were really good at that. And graphite was one of those. But if you lose cooling of that particular reactor, then things may spiral out of control. In 1983, Chernobyl reactor number 4 was commissioned. One of the requirements of getting the commission was that there be an experiment. If there was a loss of electricity to the cooling pumps of the reactor, its turbines, they're going to continue to spin, and could they use that electricity to keep the water pumps going to cool the reactor for 30 seconds? Diesel generators are going to do it, but it just takes them 30 seconds to build up enough energy.
But the experiment on Reactor 4 was not conducted according to plan.
They hadn't done that experiment. In order to do it, it was going to take more time than what they had. There was a bonus to be available if they finished that reactor prior to the end of 1983. They kind of signed that they had done it, got their bonuses, and 3 years later, April 1986, they decided to do that experiment at that time.
This failure to comply with operational safety procedures would have devastating consequences, provoking the biggest nuclear accident to date. In April of 1986, operators at the Chernobyl power plant performed a system safety check 3 years after its scheduled date. The unanticipated results would change the course of history forever.
The test that they were running, it was supposed to be done during daytime. A reactor at another nuclear power plant in Ukraine went offline. The grid operator called the plant and said, okay, guys, you're not supposed to shut down. Just keep going until 11 p.m. They already started to slow down the reactor in preparation for the test. And it was sitting in that situation for almost half of a day. They didn't shut down the reactor still.
They turned off some of the safeguards that would have automatically shut it down if you bring a reactor down low.
They thought that they can handle the power level manually, and appeared to be not.
It took them longer than what they thought, so it went over into the next shift, the post-midnight shift, arguably not the most experienced shift to do this. They brought it down too low. Directors said, no, bring the control rods up and bring the power up on the reactor a little bit more so that we can conduct this experiment. And they bring control rods up a bit and nothing's happening.
But then the power of the reactor does begin to increase.
Became actually unstable. It didn't respond in a normal way to the actions that the operators were taking.
The order was bring the control rods back into the reactor. The reactor's getting hotter and hotter and the control rods are starting to come back in. The channels start to heat up and the control rods were stuck.
The RBMK reactor is designed with an emergency system, which provides cooling water to its core in case of an emergency.
When cooling water was added, instead of cooling things down, when it hit the superheated fuel rods, it rapidly turned to steam, and that caused an explosion.
With the heat of the reactor, blew the top. It had no containment vessel built over the top to try to contain any explosion or a massive release of radiation.
They cannot fully control the radioactive core.
A great deal of radioactivity has been released.
Radiation
500 times above normal.
In the near vicinity, I think, have to be evacuated.
There would be no effective way of protecting them.
But the pictures show us a second major heat source.
Just because you had an explosion doesn't mean that the fission stops. It is burning the graphite. It is releasing very small radioactive particles.
First responders rushed to the site, attempting to contain the situation.
In an effort to put out the fire and also reduce the radiation, various things were dropped from helicopters. There was sand, there was lead, there was boron, but nothing worked.
Nobody knows really what is going inside the reactor. And it was a scare that reactor can damage the foundation and all this molten corium, which possibly maybe 2000 degrees Celsius can go further.
Corium is a radioactive lava-type substance that's created in the core of a nuclear reactor when there's a meltdown. There was a real concern that the radioactive lava would burn through the base of the containment and would contaminate the water supply. So what they did is they tunneled underneath so they could put in concrete structure which had water pipes going through to draw the heat away from the core.
There were 4 operating reactors. The turbine hall actually caught on fire. The roof did. It's made of bitumen, and as the bitumen burned, it could have spread all the way down. So the firemen who actually went up there and gave up their life to put out this fire probably prevented a real worst-case scenario.
So they had no any protection from radiation. They extinguished fire within a number of hours. They were real heroes.
Water from the cooling pipes severed by the explosion, and water from firefighters' efforts to extinguish the fire, had collected in the catchment basin, directly below the reactor vessel. If the molten core had plummeted into this pool of water, it would have triggered another steam explosion, 3 to 5 times larger than the first. This explosion would have caused the 3 remaining reactors to fail and have a catastrophic impact on Eastern Europe.
Men were sent down to open the sluice valves, pumping out water, which averted further disaster.
On the ground, thousands of civil and military personnel, known as liquidators, were brought in to prevent the radioactive fires from spreading.
You know, even robots couldn't work on top of those buildings because of the radiation. And so they sent people. It was so dangerous the men never stayed more than 20 to 40 seconds up there. Otherwise they'd get completely irradiated.
And they finally realized deep down, it was the meltdown of the reactor itself. Then what kicked in was this inability to accept that it happened on your shift. You were responsible for that. You exploded the world.
Rumors started that there is a fire at the Chornobyl Nuclear Power Plant. And everybody said, it's impossible. It's just impossible. It cannot be.
impact on the environment, the impact on human life was enormous. The radiation didn't recognize borders. On the next day after the explosion, April 27, a decision was made to evacuate the city of Pripyat, 50,000 people. People were told that they will live in the city for just a couple days, and the idea was that they were coming back, so people just left.
Initially, a 6-mile exclusion zone was set up. Later, it was extended to nearly 20 miles. Due to widespread radiation exposure, over 115,000 people were forced to evacuate. Many would never return. Reports of the disaster began making their way across the world, but Soviet Union officials were reluctant to accept the reality.
First official information came from Swedish nuclear power plant, because they started to measure higher level of radiation and they cannot understand what is going on. And after that, Soviet Union was forced to admit that it's happened actually at Chernobyl nuclear power plant, because you cannot hide these things anymore. It's not like inside containment.
The situation is under control.
How many people have been affected? How many thousands have been affected?
Well, I said 2 people were killed.
The White House says Mr. Reagan's attempts to discuss the situation with Mr. Gorbachev personally have been ignored by the Kremlin for 4 days.
The clouds and the rain brought radiation all the way to the Alps, all the way to Austria, all the way to Wales in the United Kingdom. It was a global disaster.
Their conduct was reprehensible in not reporting to the world, as well as to their own people, the dimensions of this disaster.
I learned about the danger that came with the reaction from Western broadcasts, telling us about the dangers posed by the explosion.
As I remember, it was very interesting government announcement, maybe something like 5th of May or 6th of May. Accident at Chornobyl Nuclear Power Plant. There is no immediate dangers to anybody, just follow your regular procedures.
Soviet Union was reluctant and really very late coming with any kind of advice to their own people. It was a cover-up.
After a massive explosion at the Chernobyl power plant, widespread radiation exposure forces thousands to evacuate. Despite attempts from the Soviet Union to keep the word from getting out, news spreads across the world like wildfire. Many factors contributed to the explosion, including the makeup of the RBMK reactor itself.
Chernobyl had about 1,659, I believe, fuel rods. You got to have some way to control that, slow it down or stop it. Cadmium and boron have what we call a high neutron cross-section that catch the neutrons. They intercept them. You can bring the control rods down inside between these the fuel rods. You can essentially shut down the reactor.
In most modern nuclear power stations, these control rods can be inserted into the core unto 1 or 2 seconds. The RBMK reactors, something like 20 seconds.
Not only were the control rods descending too slowly to be effective, the first 3 feet of the control rods were made of graphite.
And what is graphite? It is a moderator. So as the graphite starts to come back into the reactor, the reactivity actually increases instead of decreases. It started to melt away the channels, and so they wouldn't go back in, and you need those control rods to shut that reactor down.
With the channels melted away, the control rods could not be lowered into position. Therefore, the core overheated, triggering a series of explosions which destroyed the reactor and the building. Reports say that just before the explosion, the core reached 8,400 degrees, nearly as hot as the surface of the sun.
The engineers and operators, they were really unprepared to what had happened in terms of their previous training. They believed that the reactors were idiot-proof. And they were not.
Today, there is a 1,000 square mile exclusion zone which encompasses Pripyat and Chernobyl. The speed at which people were evacuated is still evident. Belongings have been left behind. books left open, and buildings stand idle.
The Ukrainians put it at 126 villages that were totally abandoned after the accident.
Chernobyl contributed to the disintegration of the country that built the reactor. So that country is not there anymore. Nuclear industry never recovered.
The Chernobyl reactor is now encased in its crumbling concrete tomb.
The vast tracts of fertile countryside have been contaminated.
It's about 1,500 times normal background radiation.
After the explosion, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl was destroyed. It took another 15 years before the site was actually decommissioned and shut down.
Gorbachev was extremely late to react to the explosion in a public way. It took him 3 weeks to address the nation on the issue of the disaster. And that tells you something about the Soviet culture and what was the accepted behavior of the Soviet leaders. Chernobyl changed that.
So long as the Western nuclear industry does learn the lessons that are to be learned from Chernobyl in terms of engineering and dealing with containment of incidents, then I think it will be able to demonstrate that it can produce power cheaply and safely.